Don't. Someone wave at me when I'm at like 15 minutes. Okay, so the topic of my presentation is age, education, and how those two things play into attitudes towards non-binary transgender people and the singular they. So this is way different from the beautiful poetry that we just heard about. Hopefully you don't mind shifting to a little bit of a social sciences-y type thing. So I first want to start off with some terms that I'm going to be using in this presentation. First of all, there's transgender, which for our purposes right now I'm using to refer to non-binary transgender people. So there's transgender people who, were assigned male at birth and are transitioning to female, and there's transgender people who were assigned female at birth and are transitioning to male. Those are binary trans people. Whereas in this presentation, I'm talking about non-binary trans people, which is people who don't identify as male or female. So this is genderqueer people, agender, pangender, bigender, neutroid. There's like a million terms, but I'm using the umbrella term of non-binary transgender. Cisgender is people who are not transgender, so people who are assigned male at birth, identify as male, live as male, etc., and people who are assigned female at birth, identify as female, live as female, etc. I will also talk about queer sexual orientations, which is a term to include everything like lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, all of that part of the queer community. And then I'll talk about straight people, which is people who are not part of the queer community, so heterosexual. I use the terms queer and LGBTQ to umbrella all of queer sexual orientation and transgender stuff. Then I will talk about aversive prejudice, which is the idea that people can have prejudice towards one thing but blame their prejudice on another thing. So the classic example of this is with racism, aversive racism. So someone might say, oh, I don't have a problem with black people. I just really hate when people abuse the welfare system. When in reality, their problem is that they're racist, not just that they have a problem with people abusing the welfare system. So my idea, which we'll come back to a few times in this presentation, is that measuring attitudes towards using they as a singular pronoun could be a way to find out about people's aversive prejudice against transgender people. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, singular they, when we talk about that, I could be referring to the general context of the singular they, like, wow, someone left a ton of markers here. They must have a marker problem, okay? So that's the general they, where we don't know who the person is, we don't know their gender. And then we have the queer or transgender context of they, which is like, whoa, Sam left their markers here. And we're using they to refer to one person who we do know. We know their gender, and their gender is neither male nor female. It's genderqueer, agender, something like that. But we're mostly talking about the queer they, which I'll call queer they, transgender they, non-binary they, etc. Any questions about the terms? Okay, cool, we're all on the same page. So I did a survey online. I got a bunch of participants, actually way more than I expected. 722 people did a survey for my project. 499 of them came from electronic mailing lists, and then 223 were from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is an online worker pool where people go online and take surveys for money. So in this survey, they answered demographic questions about their age and education level. They did an open response question where they just shared their feelings about the topic of the survey. And they did a scale about attitudes towards transgender individuals. So an example of something that's on that scale is transgender individuals should be accepted completely into our society. So they, would answer on a scale of 1 to 5, agree, disagree. This was a highly reliable scale, which is what this little fish symbol is. Are there any stats people? Does anyone like statistics? Okay, cool. I'll make sure to explain that part. So the fish thing is called Cronbach's alpha. It just says how reliable the scale is, how much the things in the scale relate to each other. So that was a highly reliable scale. And then they also did a scale called Attitudes Towards They as a Singular Pronoun. This is one that I developed for the purposes of this study, and it had 2 subscales. So there was the they general subscale, which was looking at questions like, it is acceptable to use they to refer to one person if you are unsure of the person's gender. For example, someone left their phone in the lobby. That was also a highly reliable scale. We've got our little fishy guy here, 0.93, A+. Then we have the they queer transgender scale, which had questions like, if someone asked me to refer to them using gender-neutral pronouns, such as they, them, and their, I would do my best to use those pronouns when talking about that person. And the Cronbach's alpha was actually pretty good for that one as well. So I was excited, my scales worked out, and that allowed me to go forward with analyzing my data. People in my study were of a wide range of demographics. I had participants from the age of 18 to 80, which is super awesome, and the mean age was 35.6. So there's great representation of people from all age groups. And I had a really interesting mix of people of different education levels, which we'll come back to, but I divided them into 3 groups. People with a lower education level, which is no college degree, people with a medium education level, which is a 2 to 4 year degree, and then a high education level, which means that they completed graduate school with a master's or PhD. And it was really weird, but I actually had a majority of my participants had a high education level, 46.40, and then the next group was medium education level, and then only 19.1% of the participants had a lower education level. But because the sample size of my study was so large, even though some of the groups are smaller, there's still plenty of people that have the statistical power to analyze them as a group. Okay, so we also had a good representation of people from different genders. I do this problematic thing for my data analysis where I lump all the transgender people together, which is not a great thing to do, but for the purposes of data analysis, that's what I had to do. So 8% of my participants were transgender, either binary transgender people, like trans men and trans women, and that also includes non-binary transgender people. And then the rest of them were cisgender, male and female. The majority were female, and then we had about a third of males. And then for sexual orientation, there's like this really great representation of people with a queer sexual orientation. Only 67.7% of my sample was heterosexual, which is awesome. So we had a nice mix of people with a queer sexual orientation. So that was very exciting to see that. Going into the actual analysis, it's important to realize that people tend to have really strong feelings about what they term as, grammar, being a grammar stickler. And one of the things that people have a lot of feelings about is using they as a singular pronoun. And you hear people in the media be really loud and really angry about this. So I'm going to give you some examples of quotations of people who really hate they as a singular pronoun. The singular they is an ear-hurting, eye-burning, soul-ravaging, mind-numbing syntactic folly. Jen Dahl, The Atlantic. For those with a religious conviction that sex is both biological and binary, God's purposeful creation, the singular they involves sacrilege no less than bowing to idols in the town square. Abigail Schreier, Wall Street Journal Opinions. And one from an anonymous participant for my study, I think it is wrong and society should try to stray from using the word they to refer to only one person. So we hear these people that are really grumpy about the singular they. And one of the things that I wanted to look at in my study was how many people actually care about the singular they? How many people approve of it? Are these people who, are they just really loud and there's only a few of them? Or do a lot of people really dislike the singular they? And I had some really exciting findings. And it was that the vast majority of people either approve of using they as a singular pronoun or they just don't care. So, yeah. So we're looking at it in the general context and in the queer context. First of all, in the general context, there's only, what's 5 plus 10? 15. Not math first. I'm good at statistics, but not math. They're totally different. So about 15% of people disapproved of using they as a singular pronoun, and all the rest of them either approved or didn't care. And in the queer context, there were actually even fewer people who disapproved of using they as a singular pronoun. What's 3 plus 8?
11.
11. There are 11% of people who disapproved of using they as a singular pronoun in the queer context. So again, the vast majority of people are fine with they as a singular pronoun. It's just these people that are angry that are really loud about it. So that was a really encouraging finding, kind of the most basic analysis, but still a really exciting finding. So we wanted to look at how age and education level affect people's attitudes towards transgender people and they as a singular pronoun. And it's well known that younger people are more accepting of new ideas, of trans people, of changing grammar, and that's exactly what we found in this study. So we found that younger age significantly predicted acceptance of transgender individuals and acceptance of using they as a singular pronoun, both in the queer context and in the general context. And these b equals negative 0.022, that's just a stats thing, it's just math that says that my analysis was a thing. And then the p is the percent chance that I was wrong. And for both of, actually all of the analyses on these screens, the chance that I was wrong in my analysis is less than 0.001. So strong statistical power, very exciting. So we also found that a higher education level also significantly predicted acceptance of transgender individuals and acceptance of using they as a singular pronoun. So younger age, higher education level, more accepting attitudes. This is statistics that reiterates that. If you have questions about the math, ask me later. Okay, so now we're going to go into another statistical analysis, and I figured that English and linguistics people wouldn't be like super into stats. So first I'm going to explain what this analysis is. This is called a moderation. So what you do is you first look at what's called the main effect. And the main effect is looking at how thing 1 affects thing 2. So you get thing 1 and thing 2 together and some crazy stuff happens, right? So we look at that first. And then we want to see what happens when you add in thing 3, the cat in the hat. And so we add the cat in the hat to the relationship between thing 1 and thing 2 and see how that changes what's going on. So we have crazy stuff going on here, add the cat in the hat, we get more stuff that we get to learn about. Any questions about moderation before we talk about an actual moderation? Okay, cool. All right, so what we wanted to see is how education level had an effect on the relationship between age and attitudes towards transgender people. So there was a significant main effect. Remember, that's the thing 1 and thing 2, just those two together. There was a significant main effect of age on attitudes towards transgender people. So people with a younger age are more supportive of trans people. And so when we added education level into that, we saw that the higher a person's education level is, the weaker the relationship between age and attitudes towards transgender people. Now we're thinking about an older age. So higher age would mean less positive attitudes towards trans people. But then education level softens that effect. So someone that's older with a higher level of education is more likely to be supportive of transgender people than someone with a lower education level who's also older. This is just, oh yeah, okay, so when we look at education level being low, the relationship between age and negative attitudes towards trans people is very strong. Right? Then when the education level is medium, the relationship is still significant, but it's not nearly as strong. That's what these B numbers are, and as you see them dropping, it goes from 0.018 to 0.012 to 0.007. That means that the relationship is getting weaker as it goes along. So the relationship when we're in medium education level is still strong, but but not as strong as with low education level. And then when we get to people with a higher education level, those people with masters and PhDs, the relationship is still significant. There's still statistical power there, but that relationship is much weaker. So education level has a significant impact on the relationship between age and attitudes towards transgender people. Now, we wanted to see how that worked out with attitudes towards they as a singular pronoun. because you would think that would be similar to attitudes towards transgender people because they're kind of related, right? We found something very weird, and that was that education did not moderate the relationship between age and attitudes towards the queer they or the general they. And when I saw that, I was doing these analyses. There's this program called SPSS. There's a whole bunch of numbers, and you push the button, and it thinks about it, and you're like, da-na-na-na-na-na-na, and it gives you the answer. And I was excited because I just knew that this was going to be a significant finding, and it wasn't. And I almost cried because I was confused. But when we started thinking about it more, many thanks to Dr. Jay Jackson and Dr. Shannon Bischoff for helping me process through this weird finding, we thought about it more and decided it actually makes sense. So why is this? What's with this weird not finding? We think that perhaps attitudes towards using the singular they in a queer context could reflect that aversive prejudice that we talked about earlier, an aversive prejudice against non-binary transgender people. So maybe people who are older and more well-educated know that it's not acceptable to express overt negativity towards transgender people. You know, they've learned that that's not okay. But then, when we're measuring a more subtle form of prejudice, that prejudice starts to come out. So that would explain why education moderated the relationship between age and overt attitudes towards transgender people, but not between age and attitudes towards the queer they. Another thing is that education isn't necessarily enough to totally counter the implicit prejudice that people who are a little bit older have had pounded into them for years and years and years of their life. And this could also be part of the explanation for why education did not influence the relationship between age and using they as a singular pronoun. And in this case, thinking about it that way, the negativity can be considered as being directed at the supposedly improper grammar of using they as a singular pronoun, when in reality the problem is that someone is prejudiced against transgender people. Which also fits in with the aversive prejudice theoretical model, which is something that I'm looking into more and is very exciting. So that is an explanation for that. Final potential explanation is that it could be an issue of people just not being that familiar with using the they as a singular pronoun for non-binary transgender people. The vast majority of people don't even think about it when you say someone left their marker here. Like, people don't recognize that. But when you say Sam left their marker here, it triggers something in your brain that says what? And so people aren't as familiar with that use, and they don't encounter a lot of people who are non-binary, so it could cause them a little bit of difficulty for understanding that. And we actually had a participant whose comment really reflected that idea. So a participant said, "It's been quite difficult to switch to they when people request that I use that pronoun to refer to them. I found it much easier this summer, for instance, when I met a totally new person who wanted the pronoun they. That wasn't so difficult, but I have had to switch from she to they for someone I've known for more than 10 years, and that has been a challenge for me." So, you know, this is someone who is open to being supportive of trans people, but that lack of familiarity affected their attitudes towards the singular they. And of course, it could just be a combination of those things, or something that I'm not thinking of. We'll see. I'm going to research more. So in sum of everything that I just said, the vast majority of people in my study approve of using they as a singular pronoun or don't care. Education level does moderate the relationship between age and attitudes towards transgender people, but not the relationship between age and attitudes towards the singular they. A higher age predicts negative attitudes towards transgender people, but a higher education level softens that effect. And finally, measuring attitudes towards the queer they could provide us with insight into aversive prejudice against trans people. So just a couple of overarching conclusions after the summary. These findings are really, really important for people who are in the field of studying prejudice, especially prejudice against transgender people, which is becoming more and more important in our society to understand. This could have a big impact on how we understand people's feelings and understanding of non-binary trans people, and it can help us understand what affects that opinion that people have, what affects people's behavior towards those people. And I really, really, really hope that as I continue to study this as part of my master's thesis, that I'll be able to provide research in the field of studies of trans people that will make a real difference in communities of transgender people and in the community of researchers who study transgender people and language usage surrounding them. So thank you very much for listening. I specifically want to thank my thesis committee, including Dr. Kate White and Dr. Shannon Bischoff, and Dr. Sarah Sandman and Dr. Jay Jackson, who couldn't be here today. I want to thank Dr. Roberts for inviting me to give this presentation to you all, to Yinda Jazz, who helped me get a ton of transgender participants, and to Ash Shukla, who helped me with the qualitative analyses. So thank you to everyone, and does anyone have questions? Yes, hi.
I just had a comment about the last, the anonymous participant person.
This one?
Yeah, because I mean, when I read that, I thought, when you meet a new person, you get it's sort of like a fresh slate, right?
Right.
Like you're introduced. But the friend had switched from she to they. How much of it was just habit that he? I don't know, it doesn't say. They.
Yeah.
How much of it was they just got to this sort of mental habit of saying that, and then it's been having difficulty switching, so it might not be prejudice necessarily, but...
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think
sort
that
of a
habit...
situation.
Yeah, I definitely think that habit has a big impact on people's language use, and I know that even people who are really, really supportive of trans people sometimes accidentally misgender people, and you know, maybe it's not an issue of prejudice and it is an issue of habit sometimes, but just because I know that the majority of people in this room are cisgender, I want to share the knowledge nugget that if you ever do happen to misgender someone, don't make a big deal about it. You know, don't say, oh, this is my friend, she, oh my God, I'm so sorry, he's a boy, and I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have called you she, I'm so sorry. That's just awkward for everyone involved. So if you accidentally misgender someone, just say, he, sorry, did this, that, and the other thing. Just briefly correct yourself, and that's that. Because that's a lot less awkward for everyone. Yes?
I'm not an expert in linguistics or anything, but this is a really interesting presentation. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, you know, as you were showing the thing 1, thing 2, thing 3.
Yeah.
You know, something maybe for your future, you know, as you work, maybe develop your work on this topic, which is a really important and interesting topic. So you looked at age and education level, you know, thing 1, thing 3.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you were to expand this project, you know, to develop it into something else, you know, maybe you know, dissertation, PhD.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are many other factors that you can look into. I was thinking of ethnicity. What about you know, the participants you surveyed,
Mm-hmm.
and also gender? Did you, you know, obviously you looked at age, which is really an education level. So these variables, you know, for your, if you were to kind of further develop this project, in other variables, factors that you can look into that can support your assertions that these factors also affect their attitude toward, you know, this kind of transgender or cis or queer orientation, sexual orientation.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. I should have said earlier, this is just a sliver of the data that I've collected. I collected information about people's ethnicity, their gender, and I've had the honor of presenting other parts of this research at other conferences that did look at, you know, how gender influences the attitudes towards the singular pronoun, attitudes towards transgender people. Something that I didn't have time to touch on for this presentation is attitudes towards prescriptive grammar, which is the idea that there's a right and a wrong way to use language. And I'm looking at all of this different stuff. So you're absolutely right, there's a lot to add in there, and I'm working on it. But like Tara, right? Like Tara said, I only have so much time. Yes.
It kind of follows up what she was saying. Your participant group, I was wondering, were you trying to get, like I know when you showed the chart, the cisgender was seemed a little bit more female than male in that section, but like were you trying to get a certain percentage of, you know, the queer pieces of the pie graphic? Were you trying to get a certain, like, what were you trying to get as far as the population?
Yeah, I wanted to get as many LGBTQ participants as I possibly could. I am pretty happy with how many I got. 8% of the 722 participants were transgender in some way, shape, or form, and about a third of the participants had a queer sexual orientation. So I definitely was trying to get in queer people, but it's hard to collect data from LGBTQ people. That's part of why I thanked Yinda Jazz at the end, because they helped me get a ton of queer participants from a couple of academic circles. So I tried, and I'm going to try more. I'm replicating this study, actually, and I have a couple of plans on how to collect data from more LGBTQ participants. Yes?
What would be your prediction if you did this study again in, say, 5 years and 10 years? What would you expect the results to show?
I definitely think that people's attitudes are changing. Like the title of my presentation, you know, the times they are a-changin'. Part of why I called it that is because, you know, we saw that effect of age on attitudes, and as, you know, the younger generation gets older, people are going to become more and more accepting of the singular they, of transgender people, of new ways of using language. So I definitely think that people will become more accepting over time.
If you had to guess, how quickly would you think that there would be a statistical change?
Oh gosh, that's a hard that's a hard question. I don't know. Okay, let me think. So there's a study from 1970 that found that about 40, don't quote me on that, but somewhere around 40% of their participants accepted the singular they in a general context. And my findings were way more than that. So that over, you know, like 50 years has definitely changed. In addition to that, if you look cross-sectionally at the usage panel from the American Heritage Dictionary, the people who are accepting of the singular they are the young people in that group, and the people who reject the singular they are the older panelists. So just looking cross-sectionally at that, you see younger people as more accepting, older people as less accepting. So as time goes on, I think, you know, even in the next generation or so. So I don't know, to answer your question, I'll throw out there 20 years. In 20 years, people will be totally down with the singular they. Yeah. My study, I hope that by the time that I get tenured professorship one day in the future, maybe by that time this study will be totally irrelevant. I would love that. I would love for that to happen. Yes?
So I think you said that you wanted your research to be used in academic circles. Yeah. Well, I was thinking it could be interesting to also give it to like education-related NGOs. Like, if you were able to do the research by geography and could tell, like, GLSEN, which states are the most uncomfortable with they. Well,
Indiana.
I definitely have hypotheses about
that.
that.
You could even do like school districts, because like if suburban like Atlanta is something like, well then, but then this other random district, like if you could go by like school district or state, and then you could like perhaps target like teacher trainings or something like that.
Absolutely.
And,
I would love to, you know, partner with someone who is good at coming up with interventions. That's not my strong suit, but I think that would be awesome. You know, if my research could help people come up with interventions in different, you know, districts and states and stuff like that, that would be super cool.
Those people definitely exist. They just don't have the data. I don't think so.
Yeah.
That'd be cool.
Absolutely, that's a great point. There were people over here before you, so yes.
Alice, did your survey ask if they didn't like the they as a term, would they be open to something else? In other words, was there an allowance for the possibility that the reason they didn't like they was just because it's so confusing and having to change and go against that grammar rule is just too much, and because they still refers to more than one person, was there something in there that opened up the possibility that a different term could be used, invented, something like that?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. You know, I've definitely encountered a lot of people who are in favor of what we would call neopronouns, which is, you know, the Z or here pronouns. My survey didn't specifically look at that, although in the qualitative comments, a number of people did mention neopronouns. But I personally am not in favor of neopronouns because there's a ton of research that shows that over the last 200 years, every single time someone has come up with a neopronoun, it has failed miserably. And the singular they is already in our vocabulary. Saying someone left their markers here is in our vocabulary, it's not marked. You don't ever hear someone say verbally, someone left his or her marker here. That would sound so weird to us, right? And so I think that it's a lot more likely that people will become more accepting of the singular they for non-binary people because it's already in the vocabulary. Yeah. Yes.
So I have two thoughts, like for big directions to take, especially that particular big finding of like how education did not do what you thought it was going to do, because then it does make sense. Because on the one hand, like one of the big implications is like standard language ideology is so powerful that like your one's belief in grammar overwhelms your belief in humanity. Seems to be, and so the more education you have, the more invested you are in this like idea of grammar, and then, but actually, so I think that's one.
Can I interrupt you for a second? My research actually finds the opposite thing. People with a higher education level are more likely to reject prescriptive grammar ideology.
But the research have been showing that they're uncomfortable with the singular they. Isn't that what you showed? That it did not offset for age. So that like super educated people said, ooh, trans people are okay.
Right.
But super educated people were like, I'm not sure about this singular they referring to one person.
Right. So that's accurate as the moderation of grammar mentality as a whole, rather than the specific issue. More educated people are more likely to reject prescriptive grammar mentality as a whole, not the specific they issue.
Which then takes me to what I think is actually going on. So yeah, the superficial reading might be like, oh, like standard language ideology is so powerful. But what's actually happening is perhaps among hyper-educated people, for lack of a better word, you have performative wokeness.
Yeah.
Which is like, oh, I love trans people, but then it's like, can you take an action that will show that support? And they're like, it's so hard language.
Yeah.
And that's BS. Like that's, and it just is. It's a very concrete way of demonstrating, you know, that there are extremely educated people who are engaging in prejudiced behavior and doing everything in their power to convince themselves and convince others that it has nothing to do with their prejudices.
Right.
Practice.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's just astounding.
Yeah.
And I mean, depressing in one way, but also I think you're right that it's going to be changing.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this research hopefully will be totally irrelevant not that long from now. But like Dr. Bischoff always says, you know, all the old assholes will die and then everything will be fine.
You're on record, bro.
But let's remember, there's only like 10% of us that are assholes. So,
Right.
If you look at the full,
Yeah.
if
But
you look at the data, the majority of people don't care.
anyway, your perspective on that is totally spot on. We're on the same page, definitely.
Yeah, no,
I like
definitely.
the term performative wokeness.
Yeah.
That will be in my thesis.
And then, you know my feelings about standard language ideology. It goes along with that. So people who are like, hey man, like be cool about grammar, and hey man, be cool about trans people. Then when they're put on the spot, they then fall apart
Right.
on it. Yeah.
Right. And that goes, you know, hand in hand with the aversive prejudice theory that I talked about. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Good points. You had something.
I'm just curious, like what your degrees is in, and also like how you came up with this.
Yeah, so I have an undergraduate degree in psychology with a minor in linguistics, and my end goal is to get my PhD in social psychology and become a professor. But in the meantime, because my research interests really overlap between linguistics and social psychology, I'm here getting my master's in English with a concentration in linguistics. So I can get that background in linguistics and then go on to get the more psychological, theoretical, statistical stuff from a psych PhD program, and then hopefully do my own research about language and human behavior, thought, and emotion. As far as how I came up with the project, I was in Dr. Bischoff's class and I was supposed to do a literature review, but I'd done a ton of literature reviews that semester and I was grumpy about them, so I was like, hey, can I do a study instead? And he was like, yeah, sure. So I put this thing together and then it blew up into a master's thesis. Yeah. He looks so angry that I've mentioned him so many times. It's all your fault, though.
I'll take a little credit.
So are you graduating in May?
No, next May.
Oh, next year.
Next May. Hopefully. Anything else from anyone? Thank you so much for all your questions.